The second verse is about the M and the D in Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally. So the multiplication and the division. We've already done parentheses and exponents. How do I do that? Like that. Parentheses and exponents. Now multiplication and division. So the verse starts by saying, Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for leaving the room. She gets a little upset and assumes that people always divide before they multiply. Oh, they do. Well, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, the M comes before the D. So people shouldn't always divide before they multiply. We should always multiply before we divide. At least that's what it would suggest. But that's not actually true. So neither one of those are true. We don't want everybody to always divide before they multiply, and we don't want everybody to always multiply before they divide. We want to work from the left to the right of the equation, the expression, to simplify the expression. So whatever comes first, if division comes first in this particular expression, then work for division and then do the multiplication. If multiplication comes first, do that first, working from left to the right, and then do the division. So it just depends on the expression. So we don't want one way or the other. And here's how we're going to show. Here's how we're going to show that part of the verse. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for leaving the room. Same thing again. She gets a little upset and assumes that people always divide before they multiply. Oh, they do. Okay? And we don't want to do that. We don't want to always divide before we multiply. We don't want to always multiply before we divide. Just work from the left to the right. Next part. But the factor times a factor gets a product during multiplication. Then the quotient is next in the race if dividend and the divisor are true. So the factor times a factor. So the two numbers, if we were multiplying two numbers together, so that's the factor is one number times the other factor, which is the other number, and that's going to give you the product of those two factors during multiplication. And multiplication is, I guess, a short way of saying multiplication, but it just rhymed, so I changed it to multiplication. Then the quotient is next in the race, and like a product, a quotient is the result of dividing two numbers to simplify them. So you have one number divided by another number, and that equals the quotient. So let's as long as the quotient is true. If you have the dividend on top and you have the divisor on the bottom of a multiplication problem, and if the bottom is a 0, then that is undefined. So as long as the dividend and as long as the divisor is true, we can have a quotient and move forward. So here's how we're going to show that. So a factor times a factor, but the factor times a factor gets a product during multiplication, and we wipe that off. And then the quotient is next in the race if the dividend and the divisor are true. And again, we're going to work left to the right. So we're not necessarily going to do multiplication first or division first. We're going to work from left to the right. All right, so let's put this all together. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for leaving the room. She gets a little upset and assumes that people always divide before they multiply. Oh, they do. But a factor times a factor gets a product during multiplication. Wipe that off. And the quotient is next in the race if the dividend and the divisor are true. Good. Let's try it with the song.
Hey Sally, tell me the value. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for leaving the room. She gets a little upset and assumes that people always divide before they multiply. Oh, they do. The factor times a factor gets a product during multiplication. And then the quotient is next in the race. Dividend and the divisor are true. Work it from the left to the right.
Good. Let's try it one more time.
Here's a numerical expression or two. Hey Sally, tell me the value. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for leaving the room. She gets a little upset and assumes that people always divide before they multiply. Oh, they do. The factor times a factor gets a product during multiplication. And then the quotient is next in the race. If dividend and the divisor are true. Work it from the left to the right.
So that is the second verse.